dietitian, right? You know I'm a dietitian. You told me you didn't skip meals.
Okay, call to order this meeting of the 2025 General Plan Committee. This time we're going to do a roll call. So I know we have 3 people that are absent from today's meeting. We have Chuck Watson, Ben Eli, and Jessica Rosenberg, all of which are either sick themselves or dealing with some sick relatives. So can I have a motion to excuse them from today's meeting? Okay, any other absences, Katie, that you found?
Second?
Oh, second, I'm sorry.
Yeah, there's a second. Second.
I'm sorry? Oh, all approved?
Aye.
So weird 3 months takes everything out of the routine. So do we have any comments on the minutes from the April meeting, April 9th? And sitting in the binder, I believe we have all the notes from the previous 2 meetings. No? Okay, do I hear a motion to approve the minutes from the June 11 meeting?
I'll make a motion.
Okay, do I have a second?
Second.
All approve?
Aye.
Okay, at this time, we're going to have time for citizens who'd like to address the General Plan Committee on any non-agenda items. The committee will listen to comments and may take any one of the following actions, either responding to criticism, requesting that staff investigate and report on the matter, or request that the matter be scheduled for a future agenda. Do we have any speaker cards? No? Does anybody from the audience like to speak? Okay. At this time, then we'll receive a presentation from Katie Wilkin.
Welcome back. I haven't seen some of you for 3 months. So the first item on our agenda is follow-up on economic development, and unfortunately, like so many, Sherry is sick herself tonight. She has strep throat, so she felt very, very, very badly that we wouldn't be able to continue our discussion. You'll see in your packet, I'm not sure what order, but there were follow-up questions from the fire department, police department, and the airport on the questions we had received, so you can look through those on your own. And then when Sherry's feeling better at a future meeting, we'll set aside a time so we can go through your questions on the economic development and maybe discuss it a little more. So does that sound good to everyone, or anyone have any burning desire to move on without Sherry? Okay, thank you. All right, then we're moving on to new business, and I'm going to pass it on to Leslie.
Before we just move on to our idea champion, which is about infrastructure, just to get everybody rethinking a little bit, I just want to maybe bring everybody, kind of get you back in the group, and just wanted to know if there are any comments or ideas or kind of things that really stuck out from the field trip, or kind of from, let's say, our first half almost of this process, because we're really pretty much at the halfway point. Does anybody have any comments they want to make, or any kind of things that they're curious about at this point before we start rolling forward into the fall and winter portion of the year? Everybody good? But
Sure, I'll make a comment. I very much appreciated the tour. I thought that was excellent. I thought that was a really good hands-on experience to see the deficiencies that we have in terms of public services, and I think that kind of showed us the importance in terms of what we need to do to tackle it through this general plan effort. So thank you, Katie, and others that organized the tour. I thought that was very well done.
any other comment? Okay, so we have a couple of cool things going on tonight. We think the panel idea worked well, so we're having another panelist here tonight. After Jose, we're going to have someone from the state land speak, and Game and Fish, my bad, please excuse me, sorry about that, from Game and Fish speak and talk about just how wildlife and open spaces and other kinds of kind of natural and environmental attributes that are being looked at by other agencies in the area. And then we're also having someone from the ASU School of Sustainability here. Is he here tonight? Who'll be coming soon. He's not here yet. He's probably riding his bike. Todd's right. Exactly right. Riding his bike, fueled by carrots and recycled oil. But anyway, to talk about just the general topic of sustainability. And for those of you that attended the beginning visioning workshop, you'll remember Arnon Week, and he kind of talked about sustainability and kind of big picture things. What we're going to do now is bring it, I think, down a level to a little bit more about what we can actually do. And so as we listen to this panelist, maybe it's, just think about how can we bring some of these ideas forward into the plan. The same thing for the game and fish presentation. How can we bring some of these ideas forward into the plan as well? So those are our two big presentations tonight, and then Katie will talk about the community art contest, which I won't say anything more about because it's a surprise. So any more comments or ideas or questions before we sort of roll into our presentations? And we'll go about it the same way. I think we'll have a presentation. We'll have people actually ask you questions, comment, and again, that'll begin to form some of the ideas and concerns as we move into the infrastructure and kind of those kinds of portions of the general plan. So if that works, yeah? Oh, and Katie has one comment.
Just everyone noticed that you had a new binder at your place, and that was just, I miscalculated how many handouts I was going to be giving you, so it's up to you if you want to use it or not. If you don't need the binder you have now, I would love to collect those from you, and I've got a couple boxes there, but I can put them over by the doors as you're walking out, but I have other uses for those, so if you don't mind giving them back, we'd appreciate it. So just to follow up, anyone think of anything on Leslie's comments?
Okay, we'll get you thinking soon. All right, here we go.
All right, Jose, are you ready?
I am. Are you? Yeah. Okay, good evening, everyone.
Eddie, can we have the presentations? Are you?
No, if nobody minds, I can just do it from here. I think I feel comfortable to do it from here. You can do it. Yeah. Just have the topic I chose to participate from the beginning was the infrastructure for the city of Goodyear. And I guess one overall item that I'd like to mention is, the challenge that the city of Goodyear have to meet the current needs and the future needs is really to create an infrastructure system that are more durable, reliable, resilient, and cost-effective, with a set of experts where they need to demonstrate to the city council that whatever their proposal is going to be, it has to be evidence-based. It has to be with good evidence. But could we put these slides?
He's pulling it up. There.
It's economic development. Okay. Let's go to the first one.
Sorry about that.
What I want to bring to all the membership here is a little bit of background. Like, when we talk about infrastructure, we are talking about 5 major individual systems, or including water facilities, wastewater facilities, transportation facilities, power facilities, and telecommunication facilities. And all of these work together to provide the services of a modern society, and also what businesses, American citizens demand as essential services. And actually not only demanding them as essential services, but many times is taken for granted. Needed is essential for a good quality of life and for the continuity of life. The National Academy of Sciences make a point in quoting that all of these 5 set of systems, facilities, they are very interdependent. The National Academy of Sciences, the next slide, please, also makes reference that in America, the infrastructure systems accounts for 69% of the energy consumption and 50% of the greenhouse emissions. That is direct quote from studies at the National Academy of Science. And the emphasis that every city, at the local level, should consider in how to use the natural resources, reducing the energy consumptions whenever the infrastructure systems are expanded. At the last meeting, we toured all the City of Goodyear's major systems. At the fire department, at the water facilities department, wastewater departments. And, and it was evident, the ones who attended, they say that the water system facilities, for instance, are at 90% utilization. So it is eminent if we are expecting to double the population, to double the number of houses by year 2025, that a lot of changes in expansion needs to occur. Now, however, I want to caution here, and this is because when I used to work for a living, I learned something out of there. And that was that if the life cycle cost of a proposed project, is not considered, okay, up front, whenever a project is approved, if that is not considered, that means including operation and maintenance to sustain, that comes the concept of sustainability, to sustain the physical state-of-the-art of the facility, then we create a major risk of wasting resources and problems for future generations from the economic point of view and also for a rapid deterioration of the facilities of those systems. So, what do I mean to this group? And that is that we need to set general guidelines so when the city council needs to approve a project, they need to pay close attention to this, to a policy requirement or something that we can introduce in the general guidelines for them to approve projects. Let me mention Albert Einstein there in the next slide, please. Albert Einstein in some of his books quoted that the significant problems that we face cannot be solved at the same level of income we were at when we created them. Meaning whoever created, many of these systems, the younger generation or the future generations were paying the price for whatever was created at that time. And I mentioned that the funding, whenever an infrastructure project is approved, the funding to keep them in excellent condition or as a state-of-the-art facilities must be approved at that time. How is that going to be addressed? And not to say, we will worry about that later. Because of that, I introduce here the Facilities Condition Index, which is an objective metric to illustrate state-of-the-art facilities or excellent facilities conditions, good, fair, or the need to replace a facility. Okay, enough of that. So now I jump to the conclusions. In my last slide is to propose that infrastructure projects shall include life cycle cost analysis. Also, that the city council should identify operation and maintenance funding sources for the life expectancy of those facilities. Where is that going to come from, and how is that going to be addressed? Now, and how can that be measured objectively? That is where I say, that the facility condition index shall be maintained at not less than 0.9. Now, what is the facility conditions index? For any systems? I illustrate with the footnote here that it is a 1 minus the summation of all the deficiencies in a particular system, a particular infrastructure system, over the replacement value of that total system. And that is why it is in a 2-digit objective measure. Now, for instance, in wastewater or in a building, let's not go too far, in a building, there are like about 21 different categories, beginning with electrical systems, aesthetic systems, general safety systems, fire exits, etc., fire codes. There are about 21, let's say. Now, a building should not look like, a 2-year building should not look like it is a 100-year-old building. Something is wrong with that. And if we don't keep an eye on it, why does that happen? Means not proper operation and maintenance occur, or no proper operation and maintenance funding happens, or somebody was careless in keeping an eye on it. But that is my summation of my presentation, and there is a little bit of sustainability on this also for the infrastructure, because in Arizona, there is a lot of solar power requirements that can be inserted into any of the projects to reduce the energy consumption at any of the infrastructure projects. And I leave it like that. We are going to hear about sustainability, but I want you to keep that in mind. Kathy and I talk about these bullets that I'm presenting to all of you. If there is any details that you would like to know more about, you go through Kathy. I can provide it to you and make it available at any time. Thank you much. Any questions, I guess?
That was good. That was technical. I'm impressed.
Okay.
Are there any kind of questions or comments about this thought? Go ahead.
Is the 0.85 in the excellent or the good cat range?
Yes, it's about Australia and the United Kingdom are keeping it at 0.90. In America, many of the projects, we go down to 0.60. And if you see the streets, the transportation system, if you go to Chicago, the streets, you get a liver damage just by driving at the streets, and that's a reflection of 0.50 or 0.40 facility conditions index. But at 0.50 and below, there is a need of replacement and do it again.
Other comments?
Do we actually have the power to enforce these sorts of regulations on the city council by putting it in this, or would this sort of be a recommendation?
I think that's a good question to bring up. And I
Yeah.
was just talking with Katie. A lot of what you're talking about, as you well know, are in facilities master plans. And so those plans, like the Parks and Rec plan, the Transportation master plan, there's a water master plan, they lie under the general plan. So the general plan would have broad goals like
We should keep them in good condition.
making sure, or maybe
Give them a tool.
0.9.
maybe the general plan could include guidance for things like that. I don't know if you want to put the number in or not, because it could, that in and of itself could become the discussion, maybe Washington wants to point 8, you know, police point 6, transportation. But I think that, you know, some kind of
Idea.
a recommendation in the plan that there is an objective measure about how we redo these facilities. Maybe that measure, is that me?
I don't know what that.
Oh, maybe that's me. And maybe that measure could be reflected in different plans. So one of the things you want me to, what we were talking about is give you more homework, which, you know.
Sure.
But maybe there is all these master plans kind of roll up into the general plan, Maybe it's worth it to take a quick cruise through some of them and pull out some of the key items or measures in those plans you want to see in the general plan. Because what I would say in response to your comment is this does go before the voters. And if you like those measures and we get them in a plan before the voters, they're already in a master plan, it does give them a little more juice.
Right.
So, and then, you know, if you wanted, you could put things like in the plan amendment process, if you were changing measurements or certain things like that, you know, depending on how much you wanted to juice you wanted to give it. I don't know how the departments would feel about it, but it could be a way to move, because I know you're passionate about this, and it is why you're on this committee, and, you know, this is the time. So maybe this is a way to begin to move that idea forward, so you're not just someone at the table who says, we need to think about this, we need to think about it, but here's a constructive way to actually get it into the document.
Yeah, I'd just like to commend the presentation as well. I'm a strong advocate of life cycle costing. I think that's a really effective measure of whenever you're deciding some new facility or infrastructure project. It really makes a lot of sense. There are books and so forth on the subject that make it, you know, a simple methodology to follow. And a lot of federal agencies that we work with have exactly those same kinds of requirements. So I don't see why Goodyear couldn't easily have those kind of features built in. I call it kind of economic sustainability. It's don't spend yourself out of business, kind of things with these measures. So I'd certainly support what you're talking about.
Yeah, I was just wondering if the city utilized any kind of a standardized system right now to assess the facility conditions, and is it consistent among the different components that Jose mentioned that were all interdependent?
I don't know that any of us really know that answer. So I think that's something maybe to look into and see how that all shakes out.
Yeah, I was just wondering about that, just thinking about it. I mean, when we went to the police department, how do you rate that?
One.
Yeah.
It's a point 4,
Yeah.
point 1.
Negative.
Negative.
And I think you're right. I think it does. It puts. There's a burden. I mean, if you put that in the plan, that's it's like a spending cap in reverse in some respects as well. But I don't know how that's done. I think the metrics are different for each department.
Could it be put that there is an optimum that we would shoot for, aspire to, but there's a minimum that we would not accept? In other words, let's say we hope it's a 9, but if it gets below a 6, then something has to be done. That way you have some leeway.
And that will deserve a lot of more discussion also with those departments, though, because they need to do a reality check as to what they have practiced so far. And, it's a mutual agreement because we recognize the objectiveness of it.
Great presentation, by the way, and I think that of what we're all here to do, I would even, suggest that we create some type of matrix, as what it was commented, to know, okay, if it's good, excellent, poor, but really what that definition is. Because if we have, for instance, the police department, it is a 0.1. As we grow, it's not going to grow. It's going to become less because obviously, you need a bigger capacity. So I think that if, with the current infrastructure, we do a quality assessment into the systems that we currently have, and then align it with the projected growth, look at where they are now, and if we did not grow, we needed to improve. But with growth, maybe something that currently looks at that maybe score excellent, with the growth itself, maybe is poor now. So we need to be proactive versus reactive, so that way we don't kind of pass the buck to other general plan committees. So maybe a matrix could be something that we suggest that we put in place.
So I'm hearing now, just for my thinking, a couple things. One, we like this idea of some kind of a life cycle cost analysis. I always get worried about those terms because you can't measure certain types of quality, but some kind of qualitative life cycle analysis. Looking at facilities not only from a current standpoint, but also doing some kind of analysis that looks at growth, but also beginning to understand the standards that, maybe some kind of a standard that will recognize that different departments are going to have different trigger points, but just making sure that we're proactive, not reactive, and we do kind of recognize that there's have a trigger point where we begin to update those facilities. And that would be something with some guidance or recommendations that we put in the plan to those departments as they update their management.
I think it can be done, but from the general plan committee, it can be phrased on the general guidelines as a whole. In those terms that already several people mentioned, somebody there mentioned maybe to the 0.6 or not less than certain point in a range, not a specific point, but a range. And so the decision makers have something to go from as a general guideline and say something is wrong. Because by the way, the different departments should be making presentations yearly as to what the conditions of the infrastructure is in the different systems. And say, we are at this level, or risking a safety issue, or we are top-notch compared to Detroit, Michigan.
So maybe another thing you want to see is a regular update on.
That has to happen.
I'm curious, Jose, from a cost standpoint, is it less expensive to put the measure in and follow it, or are you looking at a greater expense to rehab? And I don't know.
Good. The 2 points you just said it right there, but it is. I can give you an example. The city of Tempe and the recreational, the parks and recreational facility was quoted in the paper, I think, in March or April of this year. And Gilbert, they have to put $20.5 million. To almost recreate it instead of having to have spent around $5 million through the regular keep up of those park and recreational facilities. So it's less expensive to have the proper program to keep it in excellent conditions.
That's key.
That's the key.
The people that are paying the property taxes need to understand
exactly.
That's going to save them money. I'm in.
And on that note, I think that goes back to this being proactive versus reactive, because if we wait, then it's going to cost those 20 million, 4 times more. I don't know how we can put it, but all I know is education. But like in education, we have to measure certain curriculum. And even though it may be excellent for a group of 25, if suddenly we have a group of 98, it became a poor curriculum. So we have a dashboard with scorecard that even though the textbook was great or everything was good, because now our audience is different, then it's a whole different situation. Like trying to put a square into a triangle, it doesn't fit.
No, it's like a one-room community facility that we have in Goodyear. It was great when we were a town of 5,000, but now that we're a city of 50,
Exactly.
that one-room facility, no matter how nice it is a poor quality facility.
Correct.
And so, or an obsolete facility. So you're right, that proactive, reactive, the range, the idea of maintenance
Preventive maintenance, PMs,
Well,
routine maintenance.
Just thinking about it is, every department, whether it's road maintenance or building maintenance, some kind of facilities, infrastructure maintenance, there's always deferred maintenance, just because the money's not there. I mean, depending on circumstances. So, how does that come into play here? Because then timing becomes an issue.
I think it's a real important question, and part of it is, how do you leverage what is happening? So that ties into land. With development fees, and it ties into joint sizing, and it ties into all those topics.
You're no longer an advocate, are you?
But the bottom line is the overspending. That's why the country is so much on the hole, because we overspend in something, or we overbuild something we cannot afford to keep it in top notch in the future.
Right. But I would say the same struggle as I look at the city of Phoenix. I think you mentioned the Camelback Quarter is a big development district, because they don't have the infrastructure to support the new development.
No water line.
They don't have a water line, that's exactly right. And so, Phoenix can't
It's-
grow because they undersized, they didn't right size. And the cost to right size now that the development is in is big.
Tremendous.
It's big. So it is a tough thing, that's the whole overall discussion, it kind of goes to Katie and lifetime is up. Okay, any other kinds of topics? Obviously, this is a hot one, infrastructure. Do we want to come back and just revisit some of these ideas that Katie put together in the plan?
I'll do some research and find out what's going on currently.
Okay,
We'll do it. I help you out.
okay, so that was
And
great,
you
thank
too,
you.
you will help.
I'd like to.
Great presentation again, thank you. Now we're on state land, right?
Yeah.
Let me just
I mean,
introduce
game and fish.
I just wanted to real quickly introduce the subject of environmental sustainability, because you didn't get it, or, I don't think I gave you a handout on environmental sustainability because of the missed meeting, so I apologize for not getting you something to prepare for the meeting, but I didn't know I was gonna cancel the August meeting. Basically, this chapter is going to include 4 required elements. The environmental planning element and open space element are currently in our general plan, and then there's 2 new elements, energy and conservation. And we'll talk a little bit about the others later, but because some of these elements are already in our plan, I was thinking about, with our limited time, what would be really beneficial for you to hear about. And that's why I contacted Dana at the Arizona Game and Fish Department to talk about our wildlife corridor, because this is something that has been brought into our community since the last time we did the plan. There was a big general plan amendment when we brought the Sonoran Valley area in, but we really didn't think about this comprehensively, and that it's not just this corridor, but how does development interact with wildlife, and what we're doing down there could affect what's even going on up here. So that's why I invited you in tonight, and so she's going to give us a presentation on wildlife and development. So please welcome her. And then I'll hand those out for you. Oh, okay. Should I do it now, or do you want to hold on?
Yeah, hold on, and I don't want to upstage myself, so I'm going to hold back the handout. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Well, it's my pleasure to be here tonight. This really isn't going to work. My pleasure to be here tonight to talk to you about my favorite subject, which is wildlife. And as Katie mentioned, I do work for the state, for the Arizona Game and Fish Department, and the mission of the department is to conserve Arizona's wildlife resources. And one of the ways we do that is to work, of course, with communities across the state to think about the future, not just for your communities and your infrastructure and growth and development, but also for Arizona's wildlife resources. We have wonderful diversity in our state. So what I thought I would do is, let me get this, see if I can talk to you about community planning and design specifically. So what I'd like to cover with you today is the wildlife in your community and some kind of overarching design concepts, and then a little bit briefly about the idea of nature needs room to roam. So why is it important that you plan for wildlife in your community? What does it mean to Arizona's biodiversity? And then look at some of the key elements that you might consider in open space, wildlife-friendly open space planning and best management practices. I'll get into some of the most important things to think about and what some of the guidelines that that are generally advocated and that the department has published for you to use. And then I want to close it with a concept of open space and wildlife habitat in the Goodyear planning area. And that relates directly to the linkage planning and some of the conversations that have been happening within the wildlife community with the department, as well as numerous stakeholders, such as communities like yourself. If I click, it will proceed. It should. I'm just not the arrows will work. Whoops, but I need to go forward. Okay. So just general concepts, overarching land patterns that promote connectivity of large unfragmented habitat patches and connectivity of populations of wildlife species and ecological processes that are happening in those natural landscapes like pollination and seed dispersal. Those patterns are the ones that really are what we need for nature conservation if we're going to be successful within the human environment and how we change that environment. So that idea of connectivity, and then the idea of conserving wildlife habitat blocks and linkages at your local scale, so within your Goodyear community, and how what you do here will contribute to the regional goals, like the Western Maricopa County, or the county as a whole, and the statewide goals. And so it's important to think about in your planning here locally how that fits with the bigger picture at these multiple scales. And the idea that the duplicity, if you will, of efforts, you know, it's not going to be just one linkage or one particular strategy that it's going to work, but it's the sum of the total, and having that duplicity built into your plans that's really going to prove successful, because there's going to be places where it fails or where it doesn't work for a particular species that had a critical need. And so that duplicity will help you out. And so, again, thinking about what are the key habitats for the species that you have in your planning area, how do you keep those habitats connected, and then how do you integrate with your surrounding land uses so that you're minimizing the impacts. And at the same time as you're minimizing impacts, you're actually gaining community benefits. I love this schematic because this is a real good visual of what we're talking about when we talk about linkage conservation. This is actually an artist's rendering of a linkage effort that's underway in Pima County. And what it illustrates is a linkage zone between, if you see in the distance, the mountains, that's the habitat block. And what you're looking at is about a 1 mile swath, you know, that is going to be right through a community, and it includes a mitigation area where they need to get wildlife over a future highway that's planned for expansion. So the idea of connectivity and linking habitats so that you have the natural flow and interchange of plants and animals in their environment. And then the graphic at the bottom illustrates really well the idea of what happens when you don't do that and you slowly fragment wildlife habitats. And over time, those pieces get smaller and smaller. And we see that the department is seeing that already on a huge scale in the state. And we have a growing body of wildlife research that is showing us the population level impacts. We have pronghorn who are isolated populations now in lots of different species, because we've already changed the landscape significantly. So what you want to avoid is the far right, where eventually you have pieces, but none of it really functions. And I want to point out in the graphic, I don't know if you can see, but there's a real bright green center to that graphic, and the edge of it's kind of brown. And as you move from the intact, if you will, block on the left to the far right, that dark brown is what we call edge effect. And what that means is where you have natural habitat and developed habitat interface, there's an edge effect that's created by that developed landscape, not habitat, that negatively impacts the undeveloped. Noise, lights, human activity, all those things actually degrade the quality of that edge habitat. So as you get smaller, you end up with just edge habitat. And you will have some things survive in that, but not maybe everything you need. A couple of key concepts here, linkages. We think of linkages as broader swaths that are for the benefit of multiple species, ecological processes, okay? So it's not necessarily a corridor, if you will, a path through one wash, for example, which we would call a corridor. And a corridor also could be things like canyons, ridge lines, specific travel path for a specific species. So we often use the terms interchangeably, but if you can just kind of think of linkages as being very broad for the benefit of multiple species and ecological processes. And then last, the habitat blocks, just to give you that perspective. We're talking about the large, unfragmented blocks of habitats, like the Sonoran Desert National Monument and the Maricopa Mountains, places that still have large expanses of relatively quality habitat. These are some great illustrations from the Natural Resource Conservation Service, the NRCS. They have some great resources for you online. If you Google these keywords like linkages, you'll get some of that information. But this idea that corridors are better if they're continuous and not fragmented, and if they're wider than narrow, and that really needs to be based on the needs of the particular species. 2 or more corridors are better than 1. And natural linkages, meaning undeveloped landscapes, should be conserved over trying to restore something that's already been lost. So a higher value for those natural undisturbed landscapes. And then structurally diverse corridors. And I'll talk further about what that means. So I won't spend a lot of time here. And then the ideas, the conservation principles behind habitat blocks and patches, and this idea that larger is better than small, that connected is better than separated, unified are better than fragmented, and let's see, what do we have left? Multiple, more is better than 1, and then nearness, this idea of how far animals have to travel between their habitat patches, and there are very specific limitations depending on what species you're looking at. I'll talk a little bit more about that. So, switching gears to the next major topic here, why does nature need room? And so what we're talking about here is the biological needs of our wildlife. And it really starts with the most basic need, which is they need to be able to find food, water, and shelter and cover from predators. And many animals have very large home ranges. Others have very small home ranges to accomplish that daily survival. They also need to be able to move seasonally. In Arizona, we're such a warm climate that we don't have some of the big migrations that you see when you get up north. But we do have seasonal movements, and wildlife do move because of changes in forage conditions. They're very good at finding where the resources are, and so they need that space to be able to have those seasonal and those daily movements. And that tortoise there is one of your critters out there in the Goodyear planning area. And in fact, I tried to include all the wildlife photos in here are are species relative to your planning area, just so you know. And they also need to be able to disperse from their home ranges. You know, they get up, or they grow up, you know, and they leave home, just like our children, you know, and they exploit new resources and colonize new areas. And conversely, you might have some sort of a catastrophic event where you lose a population, and so they may be recolonizing areas. Oops, let me go back. I think I missed a point. Within all that movement that we talk about, the wildlife are exchanging genes, and so that kind of gets down to the actual, you know, genetic diversity and also our biodiversity. And so you're preserving those functions as well within populations. You're also, by conserving these linkages and habitat blocks, you're protecting their natural habitats and the continuity of those habitats. So when we think about diversity, I talk about wildlife, but it's also critical. You don't have wildlife unless you have the habitat. So plant communities are very critical as well. And then last, which is a big topic, is population responses to, wildlife population responses to climate change, and having that ability to shift. And we're already seeing that in Arizona. We're seeing some species like the Coatimundi, javelina, that have shifted further north. And you know, there's a lot happening. There's people that are looking at research across the globe, and we're finding these changes all over the place. And so it's something that we need to think about when we're keeping our landscapes connected. We need to keep our different habitat types connected, and we need to do that across the different elevational gradients. So these changes in how animals are distributed, they'll be able to respond. And I think I already mentioned natural catastrophes, but obviously we're dealing with drought. Drought is a very big one, affecting our wildlife right now in Arizona, and fires, there's floods. Depends on what kind of a critter you are as to which one's going to wipe you out. So it's all about flexibility. So I'm going to shift gears again now and talk about some of the key elements that you might consider in your open space planning as it relates to your wildlife. So to start with, know your wildlife. What are the species that you're most concerned about? What are the ones that are important to Goodyear and to Maricopa County, western Maricopa County specifically? Where are their critical habitats? And I'm not using that term in this case like from the perspective of the Endangered Species Act and the regulatory perspective, but I'm talking about what are the habitats that sustain them? Where are the big habitat blocks, the natural undeveloped landscapes that have lots of different critters? Where are the linkages? And this idea of creating buffers between your natural and your built environment. And then last, talking a little bit about integrating your land uses. So knowing your wildlife, there's lots of different things that we can help you think about here. There's common species, and we're actively promoting this idea of keeping common species common. It's much harder to manage wildlife if they become threatened or endangered and they become listed. And that, you know, also poses a lot of problems for communities and land management agencies. So we don't want that. That's why we're out advocating for planning now proactively and thinking about your, if you will, your green infrastructure and your wildlife resources so we can avoid that complexity. But we also have species of conservation concern. There's roughly 300 species that the Arizona Game and Fish Department has in a state wildlife action plan. The top tier of those species are species that are already threatened, endangered, or candidates to be so in the near future. The desert tortoise is one of those species. So there's that category, the species that we have conservation concern for. And then we have species that have very large home ranges, like the mountain lion, and species that have very large, just daily use areas, like a mule deer, could have a 2 to 5 square mile home range. We have habitat specialists, like the desert tortoise. We'll talk a little bit more. And then we have the little guys, you know, the lizards. They have small home ranges. You know, they're not going to pick up and go 14 miles to make it to their next habitat patch. And so they're very dispersal limited. So what are some of the crucial habitats that you have in the Goodyear planning area? Well, I know you all know this one. This is the Gila River. And our riparian resources and our perennial water resources are very rare in Arizona. They're of the highest priority for conservation from the department's perspective. And so where you have perennial water, maybe springs, even some of your wash habitats that are ephemeral are really critical. We have a Yuma clapper-rail in the picture there. That's one of your T&E, your threatened and endangered species in this community. Believe it or not, even that old stock tank that you think out there in the middle Rainbow Valley is just a big old giant, you know, dried up mud hole, not even a mud hole some of the time, but it gets wet. And, you know, those things were created many, many years ago, and they have become wildlife habitat. And they're critical to some of our, especially our desert amphibians. And what I have here is a couple of the Sonoran desert toad and the Sonoran green toad, a couple of our conservation species of conservation concern, I should say. So some of those are really critical habitats. We have our habitat specialist here, one of our desert stars, the Sonoran desert tortoise. They burrow. They burrow under those big boulders that you see in that photo there. That rocky habitat that's on the Bajadas that everybody loves. You know, everybody wants to have their dream home up in the foothills, right up against the mountains. Well, unfortunately, that's prime desert tortoise habitat. This is a species that's soon to be listed under the Endangered Species Act, unfortunately. The Sonoran desert population, the Mojave Desert population in California already is. The desert washes are really important for them as well. And our research is showing us that they actually come down into the valley floors and use those washes a whole lot more than we thought. We're currently researching them out by the Florence Military Reservation, out by Florence. Oh, and here you have one of your superstars for Goodyear, the Sierra Estrellas. So you're looking at bighorn sheep habitat at the top of the Sierra Estrella Mountains there. That's an aerial photo from the last game survey that was done last year by the department. And I don't know if you can see, but in the bottom left corner, up against the rock face, there's a group of bighorn that are scurrying up. That's a population actually on the other side of the valley in Monroe Mountain. But that's the kind of habitat they like. They like that really steep, rugged, remote habitat. It makes them feel safe from mountain lions. It's their getaway. Here's another one of our critters that has had a lot of habitat changes in the valley, and that's the desert kit fox. They like those creosote flats. And unfortunately, creosote flats are severely underrated. We often think that they're probably devoid of life, but they really aren't. And this is a critter that still is present out in Rainbow Valley. It's still present north of here around the White Tank Mountains and points further west, and it's trying to hang on out over in Pinal County where Superstition Vistas and all that East Valley growth is going to happen. So that kind of gives you the spectrum of critters and types of habitats that you might consider in your open space planning for Goodyear. Now we kind of zoom in and we look at the microhabitat level and what's important. And what's important is native vegetation and the topographic features. I don't know if you can see the mountain lion on the left, but he's resting in the crack of the mountain there. I love showing that photo. That is actually a White Tank's mountain lion. They also really need water resources, and as you know, they're kind of far and few between in the desert, and so, you know, everything from that old ratty stock pond to the wildlife, or to the livestock trough, to really great streams like the Gila River, a river in that case, or these washes, you know, that maybe only flow, you know, during the summer monsoon or the winter rains, but during that time they're critical, and they also support denser vegetation, which is really important habitat. And last but not least, space. So, I want to give you a concept. This comes from a report on the Sierra Estrella linkage design, and this is the idea of habitat blocks. And so if you look in the dark brown, and this idea that habitat blocks can be just, you know, really great undeveloped chunks of large unfragmented habitat, but they also might be conservation investments that already exist, like wilderness areas, like your county parks, like your state wildlife areas along the Gila River. You know, those are places where money has been invested, you know, for open space and natural habitat. And there's an economic value to that. I don't get into that at all, but for Arizona as a whole, our most recent survey in 2011, we're talking about $2 billion for Arizona. And for Maricopa County, the trickle-down effect of hunting, fishing, and non-consumptive wildlife uses like bird watching, photography, is a triple-digit million-dollar number for Maricopa County alone. So there's economics in that open space for you. And I'd be happy to share more, sure. So this idea about how what you do in Goodyear can contribute to the bigger picture, and I've only zoomed out here to western Maricopa County, but what I really wanted to illustrate for you in the red circles is habitat blocks that we're advocating for right now, and how we keep those habitat blocks connected. And if I zoomed out and showed you the statewide picture, you know, you would see that most of Maricopa County is really developed already. And it's kind of a big black hole when it comes to wildlife, except for some of our birds that love our parks and such. So there's still a lot of opportunity in western Maricopa County to plan for connectivity and conservation as it relates to our Sonoran Desert habitat type, and opportunity to keep our southernmost, driest reaches of our state connected to our higher elevation mountainous habitat, thinking about that elevational gradient and that connectivity between different habitat types, and that opportunity for critters to move north. So there is a plan. There has been planning ongoing since 2006, was the first effort statewide to do linkage planning. I can pass this around and you can all thumb through it. And I will leave a copy for the committee, and we have electronic copies that we can share with you. But what we're doing is what we call linkage planning, and this is a zoomed in picture for you, and in black, the outline that's in black is the Goodyear municipal boundary. And so what that shows you is a linkage plan that was put together by a diverse group of stakeholders from Maricopa County. And so the areas that are yellow are actually linkages, terrestrial, if you will, linkages. The blue lines are aquatic linkages, like your Gila River, some of your wash corridors. And the green blocks are places that are habitat blocks. And if you'll notice there, we really consider the Rainbow Valley and further south the Vico Valley is a habitat block. It actually used to be desert grassland many years ago, but now it's creosote flats. And so that's a place where there's value in preserving at least parts of it. And you can, whoops, I'm sorry, some of it does overlap, as you see. So one of the opportunities you have is to consult with plans like these that have been made. There's been a lot of different wildlife experts, both within the agency I work in as well as others that have contributed to that plan. You can see there, that's a Sierra Estrella mountain lion, and that telemetry data is actually from this year. You can see in the map on the right, the pink triangles are satellite locations that tracked that critter's movement from the Maricopa Mountains down in the Sonoran Desert National Monument over to the Estrella Mountains. And that mountain lion made a beeline from one water hole to another water hole, as it turned out. And he's still, or she, still hanging out over on the east side of the Sierra Estrellas and the Gila River Indian community lands. So we have that kind of information that we can share with you. So, integrating wildlife into your land uses, there are social benefits. And, you know, you have opportunities to think about how to design your communities. Call it conservation design, you know, and I have a graphic at the bottom there thinking about this clustering idea where you can maximize your open space within your community, or the traditional kind of grid pattern of development. And if you think about the graphic on the right, you can use that as your interface, if you will, between higher levels of development and open space linkages, for example. It's a great way to build on that. And it helps the community to interface with nature, and it gives you lots of places to recreate. There's a lot of literature, and I'm not going to profess that this is my expertise, but it certainly is an idea that blends well with conserving wildlife habitat. It's a way to kind of co-locate and build, you know, on mutual benefits. Also, it's really important to integrate your open space plans with transportation plans. It doesn't do any good to conserve a linkage and then build an interstate and a parkway and several arterial roads right through the middle of it. It's not going to work if you don't design your transportation to be permeable. And so we'll talk briefly about that. Flood control plans. Flood control is an opportunity depending on how you design it. And last, just this idea of consolidating your wildlife open space and your community open space and putting them next to each other so you build on the value. So the use of buffers can be, there's many benefits to buffers, and we'll talk again about buffers, but that's that area in between your developed and your natural world that you really need so that you can manage your edge effects. And there's benefits to groundwater recharge and stormwater management that are benefits for wildlife as well as your communities. And I just wanted to underscore that. And these are places where you can do passive recreation. People love riding their bikes in the park. So I'm trying to be efficient with your time here. I'm going to move quickly into best management practices. I'm going to share this presentation with you so that you can look at it more. Buffers and setbacks. This idea, if you will, in the graphic of the light green, that's your buffer between your dark green, which is your wildlife open space, and your built environment. And within those buffers, you really, the widths vary depending on the species that you're dealing with, but this is a place where you can do passive recreation easily and have trail systems and, you know, try to minimize your disturbance by managing pets, for example, and trash. And it's a place where you can landscape using native plants we would promote to kind of build that buffer, if you will. It's a place where you need to think about invasive plant species and pollution and fire. It should be outside of your development zone buffers. It shouldn't be, you know, already graded and that sort of thing. It really is an extension of the natural space, but it can have more human uses. And this is the perfect world for wildlife. I want to throw that caveat out. So, and it's a place, oh, I forgot to say, you know, you want to minimize lighting as well. So there's an example, if you will. The natural area on the far left developed, and then this idea of a buffer in between. This is something the City of Surprise is doing. They have this now in their general plan. It's wildlife linkage. It's focused on a wash corridor, and if you can see, the yellow arrow is the actual floodway wash, and if you see, they're using buffers. They have a 100-foot buffer, and then the wildlife, the 900-foot is where they will have wildlife-friendly development. And I thought I had a slide after that. I'll have a slide a little bit, but that's where they will be setting some building standards that are wildlife-friendly. Watershed management, so rivers and streams and washes. These areas, you really try to conserve them if you can. They're the most valuable. They have the most diversity of wildlife. They're important to you for water. There's lots of reasons. But this idea of promoting your flow, your base flows, trying to maintain your natural flows, and, you know, maintaining your native wildlife species that are in it. Unfortunately, in a lot of these areas, we have a lot of invasive species, and that's a wildlife management challenge for my agency. But they're still really important areas even with those problems. And they should be buffered just like the terrestrial linkages. Stormwater management, as I mentioned, also provides an opportunity, and it's a place for a community to save money too. If you use preserve natural channels and use soft structural designs, often those flood control mitigation costs are less expensive than your hard structure, concrete, channelized kinds of solutions. So there's a mutual benefit for wildlife and communities there by thinking about at least prioritizing some of your flood control mitigation areas for that purpose of wildlife as well. So the idea of retaining the natural drainage patterns and the native vegetation and promoting recharge and trying to prevent runoff and pollution. And reducing conflicts. Again, if you think about your wash corridors, your transportation plans have to align with those as well, or it doesn't do you any good to preserve your wash corridors if you're doing it for the purpose of wildlife habitat connectivity. There's lots of ideas, well, there's competing ideas, if you will, on community design. There's this idea where you cluster and you maximize your open space by having higher densities of development in places. But then there's the competing idea, and that would be maybe an edge treatment along a linkage area to have that community design. The competing idea is to have very large lots with minimum build envelopes, and guidelines to keep the native vegetation, and avoid fences. And a community like that can also have a lot of wildlife permeability and could be a good edge treatment as well. So it really depends on what your community development plans are for an area. Is it going to be industrial, or you can use both strategies in different places, and they will have similar benefits of maximizing wildlife permeability and habitat, and being really compatible for wildlife. And there is research out there that shows us that on these building footprints greater than 40 acres, we start to see significant wildlife impacts, which, that's huge. I always thought I was doing good with an acre. I still have deer run through the yard with an acre, but, there's a lot of wildlife research behind these recommendations that I wanted to share. So just minimizing the removal of the native vegetation. Once you blade it, you can't recreate it. Not the same, not for wildlife. So conserving it to begin with. And then combining your habitat conservation goals with your public goals for water quality, recreation, aesthetics, visuals. There's a lot of overlap with all of that for you. Including wildlife guidelines in your code of covenants and restrictions, or in your land use plans. That's more of a regulatory tool, but it helps. Here's a picture of City of Surprise with that idea of a low density development with lots of low build envelopes and lots of native vegetation. We have guidelines. They're on the web. I can share them with you. You can go online and find them at azgfd.gov and just Google wildlife guidelines, and it'll get you to our wildlife planning page where we have a lot of resources for you. Others have resources as well. For example, the Federal Highway Administration has best management practices for roadways. There's a lot, we have a lot of information on roadway ecology because this is really where the need for connectivity and began. And so the idea that in your linkage areas you really want to avoid roads, you want to minimize your densities, and you want to think about how you locate them, and preferably don't put high volume like interstate highways through your linkages if you can avoid it. You might use traffic calming methods like speeds and low speeds, speed bumps, that sort of a thing, adjacent to linkages or habitat blocks. Avoid landscapes and medians like native plants that attract wildlife, because unfortunately when they fly across, a parkway, for example, and it's kind of a perilous place to live in the median, but they will be attracted to those areas. So it's kind of a darned if you do and darned if you don't. It's nice for us, but it can cause a lot of mortality for wildlife. And then this idea of designing your roads so they're permeable and so that they're safe for people. And this is a bighorn sheep that was actually on, is it Rainbow Valley Road that runs where the yeah. This sheep was right there in the Buckeye Hills area where it kind of crosses. So it's not safe for people either. There's a lot of information we can give you here, but the bottom line is one of the solutions for your transportation is underpasses and overpasses. And just this idea that within the linkage area, for example, out in Rainbow Valley that we're promoting and that you know how a graphic of, multiple structures within that linkage area, some for small, big critters like mule deer, some for the little guys like the toads and the reptiles. The idea that you're probably going to have to put culverts and such in anyway for flood control, and if you design them correctly, you'll get a wildlife benefit out of it too. But multiple structures at closer intervals for small home ranging critters, wider intervals for the big guys like mountain lions and mule deer. And then to keep those structures free of debris and such. And to use funnel fencing to push the critters into those areas because they have to kind of get trained up on it. And the research has shown it works to do that. And then specifically for some of our barriers, which I don't think, you guys don't really have any canals per se. You do. So this idea of creating, and this is an example of a real one out here in the West Valley, overpasses on canals so that they can get across, but at the same time excluding them because they can be entrapped in the canals. Fencing can be wildlife friendly. There's reasons for it to be friendly. It can enhance the community and the permeability, but what's that? I'm out of time. They're kicking me out of here. So wildlife proof, you don't want them eating your garden if you happen to live next to the Sierra Estrellas. You don't want them on your roadways. You want to use funnel fencing. So there's different uses. The graphic on the bottom right is actually Highway 260 up by Payson, and the red lines illustrate where the funnel fencing is with respect to the underpass structure. In this case, the elk and the deer and everybody are going under the highway. So that kind of shows you how the funnel fencing is used. Lighting is a big one. Lighting disrupts a lot of light-sensitive cycles for wildlife, breeding, foraging. It can interfere with their ability to find prey. It can also give the predators the advantage, and so you can have impacts on prey species. That's kind of the opposite. So being able to canter and shield your lighting and thinking about dark skies is wonderful for wildlife. And it's great for stargazing as well. So that might be something that you would really like out in Rainbow Valley. Don't feed your wildlife. When you do promote your open space, you are going to have to deal with human-wildlife interactions. It's happening all over the valley. And these people in North Scottsdale thought it would be great to feed their javelina dog food. And when the new people moved in, guess what? The pigs were still there. So, it's a training exercise. People, have to learn how to live with wildlife compatibly. And then the flip side, being a good steward. And there's a lot of wonderful values for the community out there to have that open space. And, promoting the use of native landscapes and not killing those species that we're afraid of, like rattlesnakes. So I want to really call out trail proliferation, because that's one that the Bureau of Land Management is struggling with out here. Everybody who moves next to a wilderness area or the mountains or a linkage or whatever, they want to have their own trail right out their back door. And some of them even are as brazen as taking off on their quads, and taking off. So that is definitely, it's something that's happening all over Arizona on the edges of our communities, and that's a big one that you should really think about. I'm done almost. So We can give you lots more information. I really appreciate the time. And I wanted to close it with the picture that you have in front of you. And that's this idea of what's going to be important to Goodyear for wildlife. And this is a great aerial photo of your linkage area. You're standing right now on the top of the Sierra Estrella Mountains, and you're gazing southwest across Rainbow Valley at the Maricopa Mountains. And that is the linkage, the Sierra Estrella to Sonoran Desert National Monument linkage. That's what it looks like today. And you know, what's it going to look like, 10, 20, 50 years from now? And there's a big chunk of BLM land that crosses that. And the linkage that you have in your graphic, which I'll show you in a minute, goes right across that BLM land. So there's a real opportunity to succeed here because it is already public land. So thinking about your important areas, the Game and Fish Department thinks that the Maricopa Mountains and Rainbow Valley, the Estrellas, the Gila River, Waterman Wash, and some of its tributaries are your key to success. Okay, and so that's what this graphic illustrates for you. Some of your important conservation blocks, your important habitat blocks, and some of your conservation investments are in brown. Some of the linkages that have been planned in your area are in green. And then you have your important wash corridors, which are kind of the lighter turquoisey blue, which relates to Waterman Wash and some of its tributaries. And then you have your river corridors, which are the darker blue, the Gila River. And if you can see, we're thinking about connectivity from the north. We're thinking about the Hassayampa River corridor and the Agua Fria River corridor. And so your Gila River corridor is really an extension of those. And so this would be the ultimate goal from the game and fish perspective and from the perspective of many wildlife biologists in your community and in Maricopa County. And so I encourage you to think creatively. Yeah, I'm going to skip that slide, but just thinking about then getting down to the local level and thinking about each of those strands, if you will, and how you can make them better.
We're running a little bit short on time. I know we've got a ton of questions, so you've got your cards. I'm going to give us about 8 minutes for questions. So if it's a burning one, let's ask it. But other ideas, comments, things that we want to do with this information, places we want to integrate it, write it on the cards and we'll give it to Katie and we'll move it forward. So are there any burning questions that we have or any burning comments?
I just have a real quick question. You were talking about the setbacks that they're doing up in Surprise.
Mm-hmm.
How do you deal with the developers? Because developers seem to want to, they've paid money for this land and they want to develop it. They want to get the maximum.
Right, and that's a big challenge. And for Surprise, that's why they're putting it into their code, their city code. And then on that 900-foot buffer, they're trying to work with the developers to think about their community design in a real proactive way. So it's an ongoing conversation. It's not widely embraced. A lot of developers don't want to do this.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Go ahead.
How is Arizona Game and Fish working with the state highway department in regards to Loop 303 and the future development that goes down through South Goodyear and through the mountain ranges back there?
Way back in the first linkage planning back in 2006 with ADOT, there was a linkage identified between South Mountain and the Sierra Estrellas. And so we're working with them, just like all other stakeholders, to try to design the highway so that we can retain that linkage. Whether we're successful or not is yet to be decided, but that's generally what we do across the state with all interstate highways is we get involved in their planning. We make our recommendations. We try, to be reasonable, knowing that there is a cost to the public, and we just try to work through it and find some solutions in that planning.
Any other topics?
Yeah, so next week is the public forum for that road to mobile, is that correct?
For
The public forum for that road to mobile? Is that what it was?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Tuesday.
Because, it has to do a lot of bills. Just curious, just a little statement.
Yeah, and that's an example of where we work very closely with the city of Goodyear and Joe and the BLM to come up with some good mitigation recommendations, which I hope you will see in their planning document, so that we could mitigate that linkage that we're proposing, and hoping that you will conserve through Rainbow Valley. And we got some good solutions there. We're really optimistic.
Katie, can you give a quick synopsis on the relationship with the department there when a project comes in?
Well, to be honest, when we get a new development proposal, like a zoning, the Arizona Game and Fish does not review it currently. So,
However, when the plan goes out for a 60-day review, it is sent to the general plan, excuse me, it is sent to the state, and the state distributes it. I don't quite know how the system's going to work anymore since Congress has been this but the state distributes it to departments. Game and Fish would be one. Also, if you're a private developer, and I know these guys would chat to that, if you're going, for example, in a wash, typically that's identified as, if it's a jurisdictional wash, you need to, if you cross onto kind of a federal boundary, you have to deal with federal stuff. So all of the protected species stuff comes into play, and that's typically when Game and Fish will, in development, get brought into the discussion. Also, just I think as a matter of responsibility, typically the development community and the cities in town, they'll say, you know, this is an important quarter, check with Game and Fish. And so there's not necessarily a formalized process, but I think typically the cities and the town jurisdictions look for that interaction as these plans and processes get put through the process. Also, the flood control district, their plans, what they do is they create erosion hazard setback zones. There's two benefits that Kathleen asked about. It's a lot of times cheaper to leave it than to build a channel. So that's one of the reasons the developers are more than happy to set back. They get the density from that area that they would be building in, and they save the money from building the channel. So that's how, for example, places like Surprise and Peoria were able to move some of those concepts forward. It was a win-win on both sides.
For living next to a habitat.
Right, and people pay more for living next to the wash. Right. Yeah.
Interacting with their
Ted. Okay, you're the last one, Ted.
You mentioned that we have some BLM land to the south of us, and looking years ahead, what does BLM say about this? Are they very active when development gets near their property or wants to use their property? Help us understand how the BLM works in all this.
Right. They're very active when somebody wants to use their property. The BLM, the Lower Sonoran Field Office, which is your area down here, just completed their resource management plan. They do those management plans about every 20 years, plus or minus 5 or 10 years. And within the most recent version, I encourage you to look at it. They do identify wildlife linkages in the Rainbow Valley general area. And the Sierra Estrella is in there, and they have some management actions associated with those, with the idea of maintaining their value for that purpose. And I know alternative energy development, solar energy in particular, they have a solar energy development plan that also considered that linkage area as a sensitive area. So their intent is to promote preservation of that linkage because they've identified that in their resource management plan. But, and they've precluded some things like mining, as I recall. We can get that plan into your hands if you need, Katie, so you can share it, because I don't want to go into too much detail and give you, you know, erroneous. I don't have it really committed to memory, but there's some commitment there by BLM for that particular linkage and a few others.
Any other kind of quick questions? Okay, although Ted, I said you were the last. Dave, you are the last, and then we're going to cut it off. Go ahead.
Okay, just in general, I mean, the next wave of inventions, kind of the UAVs, and how does Fish and Game play into that?
The what? The next.
The drones, and stuff. Do you know anything about that and what
Well,
does that come
you
in?
know, it's not technology we've embraced. Although I recall, I think it was up in Utah or somewhere, there was somebody who actually was looking at the applicability of using drones for wildlife surveys. If you can imagine, we use helicopters in fixed wing at very low elevations. And so, who knows? I mean, someday, maybe, I don't know. I kind of like doing foot surveys myself.
Okay, thank you. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, just a reminder, as we begin to hear from Braden, who's next, we'll be talking about sustainability. If something pops into your mind from this presentation or Braden's, remember your cards, and that'll help Katie as she goes forward and develops these ideas and goals and policies in the plan. That's what she looks at are these cards, and those get worked into the plan. So Braden, I'm going to do a quick introduction. Braden's part of the Reinvent team, but he's going to talk. He's a doctorate student at ASU.
I was a doctorate student at
So now he's an employee.
I'm an employee of the Global Institute of Sustainability, yeah.
Employed graduate of ASU. There we go, Arizona Tax Dollars at Work. And he's going to talk with us about sustainability and some ideas that maybe you think would be appropriate to include in the plan as we move forward. So with that,
You
we're
want
going
me
to use this.
I can just, if everyone can hear me.
Yeah. Do we need the recording purposes? Are we recording?
Okay, I can do it through here. I'll stay away from that. Hi, I'm Braden Kay. I'm a employee with the Global Institute of Sustainability. You've heard from my boss, Dr. Arnhem Week. I think he came in November and spoke to you about visioning and about how to grab good ideas from other places. Does anyone remember anything from that? Was anyone here for that presentation? Cool. So what I want to do tonight is sort of give you a little sense of what we've been doing down with Reinvent Phoenix. Dr. Week and I started with the general plan update work in Phoenix 4 years ago, and so we've employed a series of methods, both with the original general plan update in 2010 there, and we've been using that work as we've done this work along the districts along the light rail. So we basically took a lot of the same type of planning, sort of European planning methodology that we'd been using, that we used in the general plan, and we've now been doing it on a smaller scale in individual districts. So that's me. Now for you guys, I want to thank you all for being here. The entire region needs strong leadership to think about what each of our cities looks like in the future. And the work and the thinking that you guys are doing now is, I know you've probably heard this from every staff member that talks to you, but you need to hear it again. You're doing important work. The only way that we create communities that are both good for our grandchildren and their children, but also for the earth, are if we make good decisions now. And so you heard some really strong ideas about how you do that from a conservation perspective. What I want to share with you now is a few thoughts about how you can take any of the presentations that come here and how you set goals and how you get excited about those goals and try to have pilot projects that come out of them. So we'll talk a little bit about the visioning we've done, and I really want to get you guys behind the idea of, okay, we're going to put some great stuff in the general plan, and you are so lucky to have Katie. She is awesome. She's done a great job of taking what can be a very mundane task of writing a general plan and really trying to breathe some life into it. And I'm very impressed by that work, and use her to make a document that lives and works for your city. And then the other piece of it is that you really need to use yourselves to make that document breathe. And you got to get into groups that are excited about certain things, and you got to get after it. So I'll talk to you a little bit about what we've done with visioning and how a good general plan vision can then allow you to get after your vision and get behind pilot projects that show people the future. My boss often talks about this idea. The future is here. It's just unequally distributed is a common quote we use within sustainability. So these great ideas, the future that you want for your community already exists. It already exists in certain places in your community, and it exists in other communities. The question is, how do you put it together into a story, into actions that make sense for you guys in Goodyear? All right. So when we did Reinvent Phoenix, we have some key goals because it's funded by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. They have, yeah. So Reinvent Phoenix is a grant that's housed by the city of Phoenix that's a variety of partners, including our team at ASU, that are looking at creating sustainable development plans for all the districts along the light rail. So we broke up the light rail into 6 districts, and we're creating sustainable development plans for each of those, for 5 of the 6. We're not doing one for downtown. And part of what we're trying to do there is create all these ambitious goals and then rechange or augment our zoning to support those goals. So some of the goals we have is quality housing close to public transit, community parks and open space, walkable safe neighborhoods, small business development, enhanced public transit options, and then capacity building for planners and administrators. It's actually not that different from you guys in Goodyear. Maybe you guys view public transit a little bit differently because you don't have light rail yet. But a lot of the same, these are goals that are relatively similar to a lot of things that you're probably thinking about. So these are our 5 districts along the light rail that we're working in. Now, we work in sort of this idea of you need to be able to know what you have. You need to assess it. Is what I have good enough? That's the first piece. What do I have? Is it good enough? And you have language that's talking about when Arnhem came, he spoke about your current state compared to your vision. And so you want to know what your current state is. You want to set your goals, and then you want to create evidence-based strategies to make those happen. And then the part that I'm adding that I'm not going to add visually, but part that I'm adding is right here, you're going to want good pilot projects, good initial efforts that link what you have now to the future that you want to see. So the key piece before, as you're doing the strategy building, is just start. Figure out what kind of small projects you can do to move that story along. The strategies get stronger if you're doing the strategies while you're working on them at the same time. So mostly today we'll talk about visioning. The current practice of visioning is just, the general plan stuff is a few bullet points, it's a laundry list of things you want in the future. What we've been trying to do is really tie those investments that you want in the future to the key goals. And that's the story I'm going to tell you here. So, and we've been doing research on this for quite some time. So we have a criteria that we've based on looking at visions from around the world of a variety of things that we're looking for. We want it to be linked to the place. We want it to be sustainability oriented. We want it to be inspirational. You got to get excited about this stuff. And you also want it to work. You want it to be operational. So we have teams of graduate student researchers. We actually shared an intern. One of your Goodyear interns was actually in this class. She's in the picture in the white. Lynn is. She worked for you guys last summer, I think. One of the things we focus on is sort of focus on where we want change to happen. And that's kind of the thing, one of the things that's happening with you guys is you're selecting key areas or nodes where you want things to happen. That's something that we do. We go around and do mapping activities to try to figure out where people are open to change, where people want preservation. These are these livability principles from HUD. I can share these with you. They're some good guiding principles. What we've done is we've taken these livability principles from HUD, and as always, take what the federal government gives you with a grain of salt and make it your own, right? Very important. So we turned the federal government's principles into outcomes that work for the districts we work in. We then we select indicators, way to measure them, including targets, and then we go and we create we have a sense of what our investments are, and we get people excited about the investments. We try to understand which investments will work and which won't. So for example, for health outcome, you want access to healthy food. We've started looking at, okay, what's the average distance to fresh produce for all of our residents? And then creating a target to say every resident in our district is going to be within a quarter mile of fresh food. Then what are the different types? So then could we create sort of vision types? The urban farm isn't right for this one. I've changed this one around. But do you have different ways to both produce food locally and sell food locally that fit that objective? And then how can you start something right away, a pilot project that matches to that? Okay? So here's food trucks. What we do is we try to put a lot of research, try to look at what other communities have done, bring in other examples, and then get people excited about the idea so that you can bring in what we call an implementation coalition, a group of folks interested in making that action happen around each of these key pilot projects. Another example, we do this with housing, right? So one of the things that we also do out in communities, this is research that's been done to say that we should have more housing around transit. It reduces your carbon footprint, and it reduces transportation costs for the residents that live around it. We go through and we try to convince people, like this whole issue with what the lady was talking about earlier, of can you convince people to have more density, to have more height? And so we go through activities to give them options of height and have them get a sense of, okay, if your main objective is to reduce transportation costs, obviously higher density is better for you around transit. But people have other concerns about view sheds and about other issues, so you have to try to figure out how to find community consensus around a variety of options. We do the same thing with getting people to think about streets. The other one is we'll do the same thing around ideas of affordable housing. So giving them different options of what could happen in the future. These are different investments you could make. Mixed income apartments, live-work housing, modular buildings, all ways that you could try to achieve further housing affordability. But not necessarily, some of those won't work in Goodyear. Or some of those developers won't buy, or some of those residents might be worried about. And so you want to try to figure out which of those investments makes sense for you as a group. And you guys can kind of decide that as a group internally, or you can do further engagements to figure out where you have support for these types of investments. We do the same ideas around economic development. And then we do this in sort of these participatory settings. So another thing that I want you to really think about is this investment piece. So if you care about for instance, for us, we have multiple objectives we are trying to make Phoenix more walkable and bikeable. That means we need more shade trees. We also have water management problems, and we have a lot of puddling and flooding in the area. So one of the investment types that we've stolen from Tucson is there's a group from Tucson that we've brought up to the city of Phoenix to create these bioswales. And what they do is they put curb cores in the street that pulls water off the street to then water these shade trees. And I have awesome pictures to show one side of the street that has 5 feet of water, and then this side of the street where you can see it's almost all drained out. So now this is what we like to call an investment that's a solution multiplier. I'm solving a water problem while I'm gaining shade trees. Now, it takes 5 to 10 years for this to actually happen, but these are the type of investments that when you look at all of the goals you have for your city, how do you get these pilot projects or these investments that you get people excited about that can solve multiple issues that you have? So this one was done by a community development corporation, a local business, and then the neighborhood that exists along the street. And it's a perfect example of, it costs $1,000 to make it happen. You do one volunteer day, you get a little design work done, and all of a sudden you have a living, breathing example of how your city is solving multiple problems and getting towards multiple pieces of your vision at the same time. So another one Katie and I talked about, and one's a little crazy, but you got to think about where do you have some pieces of funding that if you put them together, you could make something happen. So for instance, you have a farm-to-school program that has a little bit of money in the state of Arizona. You also have a Safe Routes to School program that has a little bit of money. Their objective is that you want people on the streets in these key places where folks can walk to school. Well, what about creating a Safe Orchards to School program where you're growing food along the street in key places where you want people on the street? And well, my city's streets and transportation department is going to say, well, we don't want to deal with fruit and maintenance and all those issues. And I'm like, well, actually, it's a great excuse to get neighborhood people out on the street, maintaining those trees as a way of also making sure the kids are safe as they're getting home to school. So what are those types of investments that have that layering effect, where you can pile resources into one project and pile people and things into one thing that then can solve multiple issues you have, such as, with that one, food production and child safety, right? So that's basically that's how I'm going to leave my main message is I want you guys to, one, think about how the general plan can help you set these big, ambitious goals, okay? But I also want you to think about how do you as a group of folks say, okay, There are folks at the table here that really care about having great housing. There are folks at the table that really care about having great public open spaces. There are folks at the table that really care about, economic development. How do you take some of these energies and ideas you have and bring your general plan to life as soon as you can by creating these solution multipliers? And they don't have to be big projects. It can be something that you can get people excited about, something that you can put on your website, something that you can show that Goodyear is moving forward. You're going to have this great document. You might as well find the energy to create a few pilot projects that bring that document to life as soon as you can.
Okay, so I know that you're all thinking, like, why are we doing a little bit? So Katie's going to talk to you a little bit about, you did a great job.
Thank you.
Katie's going to talk to you a little bit about the method behind it now.
Yeah.
Because there is really a solid method and it's not really math. So just that's sort of where Katie is going to turn it over.
Yeah, when I first contacted Arnhem about coming back and talking about sustainability, I didn't even think we were necessarily going to get on this topic. But then Braden and I had this fantastic meeting where he was looking at what the draft chapters I already wrote on the general plan and giving me some advice on how to take them a little bit further and to start thinking about implementation now. And so it just goes with sustainability, because I think so many of us think of sustainability as, light bulbs and really specific things rather than, how are we going to make things happen? How do we do things in efficient and effective ways? And so the takeaways I want you guys to get from this, I have notes, is first, you'll see the couple draft chapters that I already gave you, I've kind of gone back and revised them. One thing I did was I took the goals, and you had a slide on it, but I kind of wrote that objective of the goal rather than just having a fluffy goal. We want a transit system. I tried to write, the objective is to get more people using transit rather than using cars, reduce vehicle miles. Try and get really specific with what we're trying to achieve. Another suggestion Braden had is to put in there, what are the obstacles? Let's just write it out and be upfront about what are the potential obstacles. Money. We don't have a transit system right now. It's going to be a long time before we get light rail, so we have to start with bus. Just some of those things that we're kind of talking about in these meetings, but documenting them and making sure they're there so that we're aware of them and we can plan for them. And then we get into the objectives and then the policies and action items. And so I'm talking about this because as we look through the draft chapters, and you're going to be, I'm going to start bombarding you with draft chapters, I want you to think about how do we implement this, not just looking at what did Katie write, but is this something that's actually implementable? How do we implement it? Yeah, and kind of what you were saying, is there something from this chapter and something from that chapter that we can figure out this one project that starts to implement several things? And so I hope that's one of your takeaways, is as you review the chapters, you think about implementation the whole time. And then the end of the presentation, I want you to think about is if there's specific projects you can think of that help leverage these goals. It's easy to say, all right, we told the city what you're going to do, go do it. But, we hope that the citizens really get involved in this too, because there's some things that are up to the city to really take the lead on, but I think there's other things that are much more powerful. And I think Deb's an example with the healthy initiatives and what Goodyear in Action, which now is Arizona in Action, and what a great grassroots effort that has now just exploded and really taken on this one specific topic and is trying to educate and involve the public in that. Just one example. And so I want you guys to think about that too, that our last meeting is scheduled for March, but maybe we can continue on. Maybe there's some implementation projects we want to continue on with. So anyway, that was what I was thinking. That's what I hope you take away from that. So maybe that gives you some more ideas for questions or ideas you might have after hearing the presentation.
The one thing I just want to comment about in implementation is general plans usually have a list of things that should happen. And that's called the implementation plan. And then you have responsible entities. Typically those lead responsible entities are transportation department, water department, parks department, planning department. But maybe in Goodyear's case, one of the responsible entities only one that comes to me right now, only, and I'm so sorry because you mentioned it as we were talking earlier, is city center. Okay, maybe this isn't the best example, maybe it's the worst example, but, you know, if one say that was a project that goes on your move forward list, how could city center accomplish some of the goals that we talked about for wildlife corridors? I don't know if it could or it couldn't, or for open space, or for transportation, or for urban form, or for sustaining neighborhoods, or creating a walkable Goodyear. And so if we could have these physical examples or specific things, it would be a really good way for the community to see how the general plan can really shape its future. So I think that's sort of where we were trying to get with today, and to just throw that out there and then ask if there were any comments from you as to things you want to see now. You have, you know, all of you are on here for a reason. Maybe this is the reason. Why don't we have a fill in the blank in Goodyear? Why isn't Goodyear fill in the blank, you know, doing fill in the blank? You know, this is really the presentation that pulls that in.
And that's the whole point of the general plan, is it's the one document that takes everything and pulls it together. And, you know, here's a group of people with such diverse backgrounds, so it's time for, you know, us to think how do transportation, art, and healthy communities maybe work together. You know, how do we make that happen? You know, another example, one project, you know, Jerry's going to bring up is the Centennial Committee and the train depot. How do we, you know, bring synergy to that project? What else could we be infusing in that? And that's going to help them go find funding if they can say it's not just this historic renovation, but it also is healthy communities and XYZ, you know?
So the one thing I'd ask you to do after hearing this is take your cards or take a mental card home with you, but by the end of next week, email Katie at least one project or one thing that you think is going to leverage all the kinds of stuff we've talked about or some of the stuff, but not just one thing. So talk about what Jose talked about today. How does maybe doing some of these, come on, age, help me with the word, you know, cost benefit things.
The infrastructure.
Thank you. How does that bring together, thank you so much, bring together some of the goals we've talked about? How would the transportation system that we envisioned, or some of the development goals that we talked about, how is some of that going to be? So you might want to say, we need to build more apartment projects in historic Goodyear. How does that leverage all the kinds of things that we're talking in the plan? So you could send that to Katie. That would, I think, enable her to use those as examples of how we want to move the plan forward.
And I think we'll talk about it at a future meeting. We'll talk about implementation, and you were also getting into benchmarking, like indicators. How do we then measure our success and make sure these things are moving forward? Yeah, so think about it now, start sending me ideas so we can kind of get ready and discuss it and hopefully start bouncing ideas off each other. But are there any questions for Braden?
Well, just a comment about, you know, including more information in the chapters. I think that's a great idea about looking at barriers, but I also think we don't look at assets enough. You know, we look at the assets and the barriers because we overlook a lot of what we do have going on. So I think I would probably add that section in as well.
Great point. Yeah, in the work that we do, asset identification and figuring out how you take your assets and build them is absolutely critical.
Is there any, I guess, differences or uniqueness to implementing sustainable principles in a dense environment versus city of Goodyear? I mean, because, it's one thing to say, okay, we want walkable communities. Well, that means I got to make 5 miles of sidewalks to connect 2 parks. Now, I don't know how sustainable that is. Because of the material and cost to do that. But I'm just trying to figure out are there unique differences, and should we look at the city of Goodyear in terms of sustainability, implementation of the general plan? Are there unique things that are unique to a community like this versus downtown Phoenix?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you have some, I don't want you to ever, just because in an urban setting, when we talk about sustainability, we often talk about walkable, bikeable neighborhoods in a certain way around transit. If you live in Goodyear, you can still think about a lot of these same principles but you're going to think about them in a slightly different way. So you might not think about creating walkability across a 5 mile area. Doesn't necessarily make sense, but you can around like how you develop in the future. And this was a very interesting point that woman brought up. I would venture to say that you don't have a conflict of approaches, but you have a menu of approaches that you need to really think about. Do you want really dense areas in Goodyear that kind of then, get less and less dense and then try to figure out how to connect those nodes? Or do you want to find ways to have a more dispersed Goodyear where you have these areas? I think your answer is somewhere in between, where the sustainability of Goodyear really lies between finding the places that you want to be dense and be dense, and provide walkable communities to folks that decide they want to live there, but then continue to provide the type of lifestyle that you currently provide, where you have more space and less amenities next to those spaces. That's not necessarily not sustainable. It just there might need to be a slightly different approach.
Yeah,
Which is what you've done.
Right, yeah, but I think it's the issue of, like, let's say transit. Everybody says, okay, well, fine, we need a bus route that goes all the way through the city of Phoenix. And if we don't have that, it's a failure. Somehow the general plan has failed because we don't have that. As opposed to saying, wait a second, city of Goodyear, where did I say?
Phoenix.
Sorry.
That's okay.
But as opposed to saying, let's recognize that the general plan, like you said, let's look for successes. Maybe we have, a small area that has transit, but that's not a failure.
No, and so that has to do with the goal setting. So this is a perfect example. An easy example of this, one we run into all the time is, for tree and shade. The national standard is that you have somewhere between 25% and 40% tree and shade coverage for walking. In most of the districts we're working in Phoenix, we have somewhere between 0 and 10, usually around 4 or 5. It doesn't make sense for me to set even a 30-year goal for 40% tree and shade. That's not who we are. That's not the type of environment we live in. That's not going to be successful for us. But what does make sense is that we do need shade coverage in key routes to schools, in key routes to grocery stores, in particular places. So I need to set a goal for the district we're working in, somewhere probably between 10 and 15% in critical spots. So for you guys, what I would say is the idea of having a percentage of your population that lives close to transit is a great goal. But in Phoenix, I'm going to set that goal as I want 50% of my population by 2040 live next to transit. For you guys, maybe it's 10% that lives close to transit. Maybe it's 5%. And that's fine. Sort of deciding what's appropriate for your own town, whether it's for the amount of shade you have or for the amount of access to transit you have. You don't need to have some ambitious standards that they're going to have in Copenhagen or, Oakland. You need to have something that works for the people that live here and for what you already have. And so it's just about that goal setting piece, that target setting piece is critical. Because you don't want to set targets that are not who you are or that are way beyond what your city is able to manage. You want to set something up that sets you up for success and provides opportunities for the people that want those opportunities and are willing to invest near those opportunities.
And
How do you go about
Yeah, I think, again, it's like, talk about shade. It's like, okay, well, if you look here, there's no shade. Now, if we plant one tree, people would say that's a failure. I'd say, well, at least we got one tree.
And that's why the pilot projects are so important, because you set that big ambitious goal, which maybe even for you is, that 5% tree and shade coverage along important routes. But if you can tell the story of the trees that you put in at school and the trees that you put in the parking lots of your supermarkets that you got them to pay for, and the trees that you put in X, you're telling a story that's a winning story. And you don't need to be at 40% to be a winner, but you need to get the right resources and the right people around good ideas and good actions that matter to people. And so you're making a perfect point.
No. I was going to say, to follow up on that, I also think Braden's suggestion on putting your objective really just clarifies, because before I might have written the goal as we want a successful transit system. But now I say, under that, let me clarify that a little more. We want this transit system because we want to reduce vehicle miles. We want to reduce carbon emissions. We want to provide transportation options to disenfranchised populations. And then that starts to become the measurement to me. It's not transit system, yes or no. It's, did we do those things of why we wanted the transit system? And maybe, you know, because right now, and I don't know the exact number, but, you know, I think it's over 90% of our commuters commute to like downtown Phoenix or even Chandler. And so to me, part of sustainability might be bringing those jobs here. Because if now they can work in Goodyear and they only drive 5 miles, no, they're not using transit, but we just reduced vehicle miles. We just got to the same objective, not through our transit system, but by bringing jobs in. And so I think that's what I'm trying, when you write those objectives, it allows you to be more free in how you get to the solution. And
Are there any other comments or questions? Ed and then Deb.
I certainly resonate with what you've been saying, but I'd like to overlay something else. A few years ago, a couple of guys named Collins and Porras wrote a book called Built to Last. And if you're familiar with that, one of the key components for successful, sustainable organizations were those that believed in more than two, but these two principles stand out. One is they believed not in the tyranny of or, but in the wisdom of and. In other words, we can be a city that's got great transportation, but if we do that, we can't have open spaces. See, that's or, either or. You can do both. So don't let ourselves be constrained by the tyranny of or, but let's subscribe to the philosophy of the wisdom of and. We can do more than one thing simultaneously, sustainably, integrated. That's one thing. The second thing that they found was that organizations that were very successful over long periods of time also subscribed to another principle called the BHAGs, B-H-A-G-S. The BHAGs stands for Big, Hairy, Audacious Goals. So settling for one tree, that's good. That's good enough maybe for today or next month. But what about next year? Where should we be? How about 5 years from now? So the idea of those organizations that were creative were willing to go out on a limb and find very big, hairy, audacious things. Like, I don't know, taking that Gila River corridor and making it into something that, you know, is just magnificent, or the Bullard Wash or whatever. But the point is, there's two principles that I would like us to not lose sight of and be constrained. We can do more than one thing, not be subscribed to the tyranny of or, but the wisdom of and look for BHAGs that'll push this community, this city, to heights that it never even thought existed.
Yeah, I just was wondering, Braden, how can we partner as a city with ASU with some pilot projects that we have ideas for? Grant funding, you know, research assistance. How do you see us partnering with ASU?
So my research lab does some of this type of work. Luckily, the Global Institute of Sustainability has a new sort of consulting arm of a bunch of folks that are willing, are taking on projects like this, helping. So right now they've done a greenhouse gas inventory for the city of Phoenix. They're helping support some solar projects. They're helping, they'd love to get into some tree and shade programs. They haven't done anything like that yet. So both between my lab and then with the support services of this new sort of consulting team at the Global Institute, there are opportunities for the institutes and these types of projects. Thanks for that question. Really appreciate it. And I'll leave my two copies of my card ready from it that has thoughts or
Are there any other questions, comments, or Okay.
Thank you so much for your time. Good luck
Thank
with
you.
your work.
Okay. Ideas, projects, leveraging, please send some of those ideas to Katie over the next couple of weeks. Don't let this opportunity pass you by. And we will bring those ideas back for discussion. So we're not going to let this one go away. And now next is community partners.
Don't worry, I'm going to fly through this, but I just wanted to also let you know that I haven't dropped. I know like energy is a big topic, and I think some of you have been talking about it, and I would, if any of you have specific ideas on energy, write it on your cards or let me know. But I did want to let you know one reason why I didn't specifically pull energy into this discussion, because we have so many things to discuss and it's kind of got to pick and choose, is the city of Goodyear has done some energy planning. Mayor Kavanaugh had signed, there was an opportunity to sign the Kyoto Protocol. Mayors of cities throughout the country were invited to, and the city of Goodyear did. So through that, we did some energy planning, energy analysis. So we actually have a lot of good data now. And I just pulled a few highlights of recommendations from that planning we did. It was listed as a big idea was should Goodyear be carbon neutral by 2030? So you can write responses to that on your cards. But some of the recommendations, we talk about them over and over again. Compact and walkable housing. It seems to come up every single meeting. There was recommendations about reducing the city's fleet. And another real big one that can make an impact is replacing streetlights with LED lighting. There's also really, really specific things, but those were just a few highlights. So I just wanted to let you know that that's part of why I didn't bring it to this group, because a lot of work has been done. But I just got a hold of some of that information, so if you're interested, I can make that available to everyone, and you can let me know other ideas. I don't want to stifle ideas. You know, I didn't leave it out so that you guys couldn't bring up good ideas. The other thing I just wanted to bring out, and I put some information about LEED. It's a really hot topic in your packet. And for those who don't know, it stands for Leadership in Energy Environmental Design, and LEED certifies buildings that are green. And there's a wide range of certifications, and there's been a suggestion that should all future city buildings be LEED certified. And getting the minimum LEED certification isn't that costly. So it's that minimum is actually a very achievable goal. There's also LEED neighborhood design, and I gave you some information about that, and that isn't quite as prolific right now, but it has some good principles, but it's the principles we've been talking about already. I don't think you'll be surprised. So are there any questions about energy before I move on?
I guess just one quick, what about solar energy initiatives? Besides the 5% that was established some time ago by 2015, but what about requiring the city buildings, you know, with solar power for 50% of their energy or 40%, period?
When I ask the other departments about the infrastructure stuff, that we can ask our facilities person. Yeah, write that idea on a card.
Well, that's a requirement. I mean, without any options, because what they usually do is, well, we put it as an option. If we have the money, we will put solar power. No, that should be included in the base price of the total building, no option.
You know,
I mean, that's
I could actually say one thing about that, having kind of got one of these green. Solar is actually the last thing you want to do. It is very, very costly. And there's so many other things that you can do when you build a building to reduce energy costs and energy use. Solar is sort of the icing. Typically, a lot of energy people will tell you, just this is an aside, solar is the icing on the cake. I agree with you. I think it's important.
Yeah, I don't believe that is the last thing.
It shouldn't be the objective. It should be energy reduction. And I think that's where these green globes and LEED and all these other kinds of building standards get you to, is how do you reduce your energy footprint in a meaningful and sustainable way.
Okay.
And that'll be probably next week, or next month, I mean, on energy?
Huh?
So we're talking about that next month?
No.
Energy?
This is it.
This is it.
Well, you know what though? Let's not say that.
Okay.
Is energy or reducing the city's energy footprint something that we want to talk about, or do we want to wait, let Kate kind of write that element, and then see if it kind of addresses what we're concerned about? If it doesn't, we'll have the discussion. How do you want us to proceed? It's up to you.
Let me tell you real quick our schedule. We've got September right now on the calendar is water and now economic development. We've got October, which is on the schedule right now for the land use plan, which I think we could spend every minute on the land use plan. For November, we've got a check back from Transportation and Parks on their master plans. And then December is reviewing the entire draft plan, so I can send it out for a required 60-day review. And I really, really, really need to hit that date. So we've got 3 more topical meetings. That's what I'm saying. I've had a hard time picking and choosing what do we discuss and what do we review.
Having said that, it's your plan. So do you want to wait till that element comes out, read it? If we have problems with it, we'll go back and beat it up, or do you want to have a session on it? It's up to you guys.
I got some opinions on energy, but.
So, okay, what I want you to do is, we're kind of in we're like double tracking mode, we're in strategic planning mode. Please email those ideas to Katie, very seriously, and we'll get those in. So anybody that has ideas on energy, has ideas on implementation now, needs to email that in to Katie. Has ideas on wildlife, email that in.
I was also going to suggest a last call on the idea champions, that if you hadn't presented and you changed your mind, I did want to present that we can fit that in the November meeting. So, if a couple of these topics now you're hearing, oh, I thought we were going to get to that, and it turns out we're not getting to that. But, I'm going to suggest maybe that would be a great idea champion topic to make sure it gets addressed, even if it's kind of quickly and short.
And that's important because the draft plan is when you see it all, and that's when a lot of these big changes are going to, occur. It doesn't mean that it's not changeable. The draft plan is where it is most changeable. So, if, for example, energy is important, maybe that's a good time. Read the element, then you can be an energy idea champion. We can get that into the December draft. And I'm picking on you, but I don't mean to pick on you.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. Okay, and I just wanted to give you a couple of updates of other things I'm doing. One is, I haven't forgotten, I remember agriculture was brought up a while back. I happened to get hooked up with the Future Farmers of America groups at Millennium High School and Desert Edge High School. And they're always looking for class projects, so I'm trying to coordinate with them to do the work for me and go contact our agricultural community and find out who's interested in preservation, and hopefully they can be a good partner. I think that the people respond to students so well, too. They're always so happy to talk to students. So I thought it'd be a great partnership, great opportunity, way to get some help. So just so you know that that's going on, we might get an update from students in the future. The other thing I wanted to let you know is I've heard a lot about art from this committee, and so I was thinking, how do we get art in the plan? And I've been thinking about the art goals, but then I also had an idea that what we could do, again, something I don't have to do now, is have a community art contest for the cover of the general plan. And to show you an example, Des Moines, Iowa has done it for years with this annual performance report that they do. And this is the only one I could find on quick notice, but some of the past ones are amazing. People do oil paintings. I mean, they're professionally done, and you just need a digital image of it. And so I'm working with the Art and Culture Commission. I was hoping, Jessica's sick, and Jessica, if you didn't know, is on the Art and Culture Commission, so she's been helping me with this. But what we're planning to do is it's going to be open to Goodyear residents only. Our first prize is going to be $500 for the winner who's on the cover, and then we're going to, depending on the number of submittals and how quality they are.
Autograph thing of the general plan by everybody.
You bet. There's going to be $100 sub-winners that can be the chapters. We're going to have a component to put the works on Goodyear Connects and award a special community choice award so that people can go on Goodyear Connects and vote for their favorite. And so I hope that it's a way to drive traffic. So I just thought it was a neat way to get another sector of the community involved. And if art is important, we'll throw it on the cover of the plan. And so we'll get more details to you. We have a great art specialist at the city, and so she knows how to get to the art communities and get the word out. But, we'll look for your help to get the word out, too. And If anyone, we're still putting the details together, but I know there's been a couple presentations on art. So if anyone is really hoping to be on the jury to review the art, send me an email. We'll see what we can do. We need to keep it at a certain size, but let me know if you're interested. And oh, this is just an example. It was just another way to get the word out. So this was an article about the cover of the art. So they started getting, press just about the art contest, which gave press about their performance report. So I hope the same thing happens with the general plan. So just hope everyone's okay with that. That we're so.
Great idea.
All right, so that's it. Next month we have water, which is a continuation of infrastructure and services. So you had gotten a handout back in May about infrastructure and services. And we heard our idea champion from Jose tonight, but we have Peter, Jessica, and Eduardo on the plan. And that's your only homework, because I didn't get my draft chapters done over the summer. Oh, to give me, everybody has to think of a project and send it to me.
And if you think of it now, put it on the card and we'll take it.
Yeah, and if you think of other thoughts when you get home that you wish you wrote on a card, email those too. That's what I have. Did I miss anything? What do you guys have?
You know me, I'm just gonna put together and stuff in the binder.
The only word they did hours ago.
I'll bring my binder.
No, it was the original one. I just picked one up over there.
Arizona Game and Fish. I got cards.
He's got a stack down here.
Stack. Put somebody to sleep. Come on. See, all these